Chapter 3. David Harker replaced the receiver with an angry thump. The news was bad enough as it was, but having to relay it to Chapel, who was already in a foul mood because of that stupid bitch Travers. "That was the security sweep report, no doubt?" asked Chapel expectantly. Harker nodded. Chapel wasn't one for preamble or polite conversation, but then again, neither was he. "Something's missing. Everything of value in ACL, from packets of printer paper to tablet and printers, was tagged electronically, and the security sweep compared its recorded inventory against what it scanned. And tonight, it had discovered a discrepancy and had phoned Harker to tell him, with all the welcome of a double-glazing salesman. Chapel sighed and pushed himself out of the chair. "This really isn't my day, is it? Let me guess. One of our ex-employees has decided to increase their severance payout and leave here with some of my fixtures and fittings." He groaned and rubbed his high forehead. "What's missing then? A tablet, a box of flopticals." "One floptical. This is it," decided Harker. "This is where everything goes pear-shaped." Chapel's eyes sparked with restrained fury. "Tell me I'm wrong, David. Tell me that this floptical was blank." Harker looked downwards and coughed before replying. "No, Ashley, it wasn't." "For the love of God!" the other exploded. "What sort of an operation are you running here, David? Why the hell did I install one of the most sophisticated security systems in the industry? What's the point of having that security guard on the door?" He sat down again and rubbed his eyes with his palms. "What was on the diskette?" he asked quietly. "COSU-5, Harker muttered, bracing himself for the reaction. It didn't take long. "I can't believe I'm hearing this. COSU-5 is one of the few parts of the codex that can run standalone." Harker was forced to agree. Most of the codex architecture was dependent upon being surrounded by a host of support programs. COSU-5's design meant that it could run on any computer with Paradigm installed. Chapel's anger continued. What if somebody does run it and gets curious about the results? And then he sank into the chair. "What am I saying? If they run it, of course they'll get suspicious. How many other programs?" He trailed off and slammed the table, making the tablet jump into the air. "COSU-5 is Campling's module, isn't it?" Harker nodded, even though he knew that the question was rhetorical. Chapel knew every module, every subroutine, every line of code of the Millennium Codex, and he also knew exactly who was responsible for each one. "But he's not likely to have nicked anything. He's sound." "I know that. I chose him to work on the codex, didn't I?" The implication was clear. If Chapel employed them, they had to be okay. Chapel continued. "Let's just hope that my wonderful security system is worth all the inconvenience of its installation." Turning to the tablet, he clicked and typed with his usual prowess. Less than a minute later, a window had appeared. "Let's assume that the floptical was stolen from Campling's desk, shall we?" Chapel continued typing. As Harker watched, he entered the day's date and 2 times, 9 a.m. and 6 p.m., and then the location of Campling's desk in the shorthand used to specify any part of the ACL office complex, and then he pressed the Enter key. Another window expanded from nothing. This one was a video replay, showing Campling's desk. Chapel instructed the security system to fast-forward the mundane to-ings and fro-ings. Campling's arrival was there, as he unpacked his briefcase and powered up his tablette. A few informal chats with colleagues who were leaving. The odd coffee break. All of this took place at an almost unwatchable speed, but Chapel seemed to absorb everything. After a few minutes of frenetic video, Harker's attention was seriously wandering, but a satisfied "there" from Chapel brought him back to the screen. The freeze-framed image showed someone holding the diskette in question. "Our guilty party, David, do you recognize him? He's not one of my programmers." Although Chapel knew every single programmer in ACL, whether they worked on the probe product or were members of his private army, the peripheral people, as Chapel called them, were a faceless mass. Testers, technical writers, support staff. To Chapel, they were as individual as cupboards or vending machines, a resource to be used. But Harker had made it his business to know everyone, however inconsequential. "It's Barry Brown." "Brown?" Chapel stroked his chin and raised a finger as he remembered. "Ah, yes, our resident alcoholic technical writer." Still feeling vulnerable after his phone call to Julia Prince, Harker automatically leapt to Brown's defense. He was very good at his job, Ashley, and he'd always found him an entertaining companion in the smoking room. Chapel shrugged dismissively. So, I've always found it very difficult to take someone seriously when they smell of alcohol at 10 o'clock in the morning, but that's wholly irrelevant. He's stolen part of the codex, David, and that is a crime beyond imagining. But we have Campling's work in library storage. That isn't the point. Someone out there, he jerked a finger towards the window, has a copy of a computer program which could seriously incriminate us. If this Brown person runs COSU-5, he will encounter something so far beyond his comprehension that he may very well call in people who might understand it. UNIT, for example. And wouldn't dear old Anne Travers like that, eh? Harker knew that Chapel had probably already formulated a solution, so he kept quiet. But he reckoned that Chapel was overreacting. Brown may have once been a programmer, but he couldn't possibly understand what the module was designed to do. So he was hardly likely to call in UNIT, was he? Anyway, Brown can be dealt with quite easily, continued Chapel, closing down the security application. By the time this evening is over, he'll be very sorry that he pried into my research. Harker shuddered. Despite his reputation as ACL's hard man, he hated unnecessary violence. But he could see Chapel's point. Barry Brown had to be shown that silence was the best policy, and he would act as the perfect smokescreen while Melanie Bush started hacking. "Are you sure that you want to go home?" asked the doctor. "We're only a taxi ride away from the TARDIS, and there's plenty of room at the inn, I assure you." Anne was torn. If she had read the signals correctly, the doctor's offer of a bed promised a lot more, and since her husband's death, such comforts had been few and far between. But she had to sort something out, and that took precedence over her desperate needs. "Honestly, Doctor, I appreciate the offer, but I really do need to get home. My cats will wonder where I am," she added with a forced laugh. "It's your decision." He grabbed her hand and gave it a very chivalrous kiss. "I'll see you tomorrow as arranged, then?" She nodded. "Definitely. I'll look forward to it." She turned to Mel and touched her on the shoulder. "Very nice to meet you, Melanie. Will you be coming along tomorrow?" Mel shook her head. "No, I think I'll go shopping." She smiled, but her tooth and curls bonhomie wasn't convincing. "Best to stick to the things that I'm good at." Anne couldn't be certain, but she was sure that she detected the slightest tinge of jealousy in the young woman's voice. Was there something going on between the doctor and his latest travelling companion? But no. Surely the doctor wouldn't be interested in this diminutive, hyperactive genius. She took her hand off Mel's shoulder and gestured behind her towards the entrance to the station. "I'd better get going. I'll need a good night's sleep if we're going spying tomorrow." "So be it." The doctor put his hands at the lapels of his tuxedo. "See you at 11? 11 it is, Doctor," she agreed, before giving a cheery wave and walking down the stairs into Tottenham Court Road Tube. She was still wondering whether she should have stayed in the TARDIS that night when she eventually got off the tube at Holborn and set off for the Library of St. John the Beheaded. 3 mugs of black coffee later, Barry and Louise sat silently in the living room. She was curled up on the sofa with her legs tucked underneath her. He was sitting on the armchair, clasping the empty mug and staring into the brown-stained interior. Every few minutes, his eyes wandered to the black object on the table, before snapping back as his mind refused to comprehend it. As far as conversation between he and Louise was concerned, the incident might never have happened. Everything they talked about was so mind-numbingly normal. Mortgages, Sainsbury's, the weather. As if they were both desperately trying to reassure themselves that their familiar world hadn't just flipped over to become a nightmare, where printed circuits were transformed into silk from a magician's pocket. "We can't just ignore it, can we?" Louise's words broke his reverie. She untangled herself, rose and walked over to the table. "It happened, and no amount of small talk is going to change that." Barry couldn't help laughing. Once again, Louise's thought processes were in parallel with his own. "What do you suggest, then? Perhaps I should phone up Chapel and complain that his top-secret software has blown up your computer." Not Chapel, no. She chewed a nail, and Barry knew that she was about to suggest yet another of her harebrained schemes. James Campling. Campling? He jumped. Why the hell should he help us? Guilt made his words harsher than they should have. Guilt by association. The Floptical was, after all, Campling's to begin with. Louise gave a wicked smile, clearly unaware of his reaction. Because he fancies me. Tart! A humorous explosion of guilt, but Barry knew it was hiding his jealousy. She shrugged innocently. If you've got it, flaunt it. That's what I say, she said, coquettishly. Barry suddenly remembered that they weren't alone. What about Cassie? We'll leave her here, muttered Louise, but she must have seen his horrified expression. She quickly added, Not on her own, you idiot. I'll give my mum a ring, get her to babysit. I'd drop Cassie off there, but it's in the opposite direction from James's house, she added. Barry raised an eyebrow. Oh, yes? How do you know that, then? She sighed in exasperation. Don't be so suspicious. He's invited me for dinner there enough times. And before you ask, no, I haven't ever taken him up on it. I just happen to remember the address. She looked at the carriage clock on the mantelpiece, and a sinking feeling reminded Barry that it was her 10-year clock. 9:30. I'll phone Mum and then a taxi, and then I'll give James a ring, she said seductively. I know he won't refuse a visit. God, ACL really was the wrong profession for you, wasn't it? He didn't like the idea, but if they could get some answers, well, it was worth it. Probably. Chapel's own office was exactly the same size and shape as Harker's, but considerably better furnished. While Chapel's head of development had to make do with standard office furniture, Chapel had surrounded himself with a small fortune in antique furnishings. Authentic old masters hung on the walls, which were themselves wood panelling transplanted from one of Chapel's country mansions, vying for space with the exotic tapestries that he had picked up on his many visits to the Middle East. It was a home from home. Then again, with the hours that he always dedicated to his work, it might as well be home. In truth, the trappings represented only the minutest fraction of his vast wealth, but they were sufficient to impress the plebeians he employed. Had employed, he reminded himself, even the advanced research team would be out of a job at the stroke of midnight the next day. Then again, things would be very different for everybody come midnight, and he very much doubted that unemployment would be high on most people's priorities. His reason for returning to his office was simple. His computer setup was more powerful than Harker's, with access to some extremely powerful, not to say unusual, software. One particular application interfaced with all the various telephone networks, and Chapel was currently finding it very useful. Especially the call from the foyer, when that hapless security guard had phoned for a taxi. Chapel cross-referenced the taxi's destination with the personnel files in seconds, and came up with the answer. Brown had gone to Louise Mason's house in Battersea. He sighed. Brown was a technical writer, a profession that Chapel had very little time for. It was only a matter of time before software documented itself, making it a bit of a dinosaur as jobs went. But Mason, she was a programmer, that most glorious of roles. Her work had been brought to his attention on a number of occasions, and he had considered offering her a place with his advanced research team. But a cursory look at her circumstances had immediately ruled that out. She was a single parent, and in Chapel's experience, that was incompatible with the dedication he demanded from all his people. But her complicity in the matter of the stolen Floptical vindicated Chapel's decision. She was untrustworthy, deceitful, and downright dangerous. Although there was only just over a day left until he was due to run the Codex, he couldn't afford to take the chance of the operation being shut down by Anne Travers's army thugs, should Brown or Mason go running to the authorities. Despite his dislike of Travers, he had to admit a grudging admiration for her professionalism, and if she suspected anything at all at ACL that might possibly fall under her remit, UNIT would come marching in immediately. An information window suddenly popped up on his tablet screen. He had released a tiny program into the phone system, one which would tell him if any calls were made either to or from Mason's number. And now it was doing just that. Even as he watched, 2 more calls were added to the list in the window. The first was to a taxi firm. The second was to her mother, more cross-referencing, this time to the next of kin field on Mason's records. And the third, Chapel didn't need to consult his records to check on that number. He had made it his business to memorize the home numbers of all his research team in case he ever needed to call them at home. which was quite often. Private lives took second place to ACL. With a twisting feeling in his stomach, he knew that it was Campling. This put a whole new complexion on his problems. He would have sworn that Campling's loyalty was beyond question, but his upcoming tryst with Mason and Brown suggested otherwise. For one terrifying second, he wondered whether he could trust anybody at ACL, even David Harker. Then he re-established his equilibrium. With Campling implicated, time was now of the essence, and such a desperate situation demanded desperate measures. He sighed. Mason and Brown had no idea of the magnitude of their crime, and simply frightening them off would be sufficient. But Campling, his betrayal had sentenced him to a far more serious fate. Chappell picked up the phone and dialed his secretary. "Jill, is Derek Peartree still waiting? Excellent. Could you send him up, please?" Replacing the receiver, he stood from his desk and strode over to the wall opposite the door. The wall was no different from the other three, wood-panelled and hung with famous works of art. Chappell reached out his hand and tapped out a complex rhythm on one of the panels, then stepped back as a door-shaped section of tapestry simply blinked out of existence. Solid holography was still in its infancy as far as the scientific community was concerned, but that was mainly because Chappell had both bought all the patents and persuaded his friends in the government to suppress any further research. There were 13 such solid hologram doors in the ACL suite, but Chappell had only found a use for one, this one, in his office. The room behind the illusory door was about the same size and dimensions as his office, but there the resemblance ended. The walls were hung with blue-black drapes, shot through with gold and silver filaments. The only illumination came from the concealed lighting in the black ceiling. Their pale amber glittered off the filaments, making it look like a satanic fairy grotto. Chappell smiled at the imagery and walked towards the centerpiece of the room, a large black cone engraved with runes and symbols. The only other object in the private chamber was a large golden statue that would have been familiar to any of ACL's ex-employees, or those embarrassingly few people who had ever bought ACL software. A rearing antelope, the defunct company's logo. Chappell laid both hands on the cone and closed his eyes in intense concentration. The result was striking. The cone flared with a blinding light that shot upwards in a pillar of ruby incandescence, hitting the ceiling and apparently passing straight through. An observer, not that anyone save Chappell had ever seen the phenomenon, might have considered it to be magic, but the truth was far less mystical, though no less impressive. Underneath the runic trappings that Chappell enjoyed so much was the most complex micro-monolithic circuitry array ever constructed. As ever, he gave thanks to his ex-employer, Tobias Vaughan, and his Cybermen allies for designing the technology in the first place. The fact that he held the patent was simply the spoils of war, as far as he was concerned. Linked in concert, the array became a psionic focusing device, feeding off the mental energies in the immediate vicinity and amplifying them. The more circuits, the greater the amplification, and Chappell's cone was the largest array ever built. With every passing second, the pillar of light pulsed with constantly re-amplified energies until the blue-black tapestries themselves began to fluoresce. The psionic capacitors housed in the pyramidal summit of Canary Wharf Tower had reached the limits that Chappell had specified. Now that he had sufficient psychic energy, it was time for a different sort of magic. People such as Anne Travers might know about micro-monolithic circuits, but they had no idea of the power of Sarah Quazell. Then there was a knock at his door. He turned to see Derek Peartree entering his office and smiled. There was a very sad individual who was about to become very happy. "I don't like her. I don't like her at all." The doctor opened the door of the TARDIS, ushered Mel inside and closed the great doors before responding. "Aren't you being a little premature?" he asked, removing his bow tie with one hand and extracting himself from his dinner jacket with the other. With the legerdemain of a conjurer, he stored the tie in the jacket pocket and flung the jacket on the hat stand in one fluid movement. "She means well, but she's a dried-up old spinster with a vendetta against Ashley Chappell," Mel pronounced, lying down on the red velvet chaise longue that the doctor claimed was from a variant of the Roman Empire he had visited not so long ago. If it was good enough for Cleopatra, it was good enough for her, Mel decided. "Dear, oh dear," said the doctor, turning from the hexagonal control console. "Who's rattled your cage?" "Nobody," she snapped. "It's nothing." The doctor perched himself on the wooden arm of the chaise longue and stared at her. "Come on, Mel. What's the matter? It's not like you to be so bitter." She sighed. "It was the reunion. Doctor, they were all 10 years older, but for me it's only been a couple of years. A couple of years spent cooped up in here." She waved a hand around the roundelled white walls of the TARDIS, "while they've been living real lives." "Real lives? Real lives?" He leapt from the couch like an electrified cat. "And what have we been doing, eh? Or have you forgotten the vicious Heracletes, or the Stalactrons with their inhuman plans for mankind?" He span round with his arms outstretched. "Or the Vervoids?" he proclaimed. "Without my cunning scheme to use Viennesium, Earth would have become a galactic compost heap." Mel smiled. "We haven't met them yet, remember?" For some strange reason, the doctor seemed obsessed with the Vervoids. Apparently they were some sort of nasty alien plant race, but every few weeks he would start mentioning them. "Or, are you about to tell me about them?" No, this is neither the time nor the, time. But the point is, Mel, I can drop you back minutes after we left Pease Pottage. You can have the chance to live those years. Nothing's been wasted." "But I've changed my own future," she exclaimed, sitting up. "If you drop me back, I'll end up meeting myself at my own college reunion." "Probably not," muttered the doctor, fussing over the console. "And what is that supposed to mean?" He shrugged. "Time has a marvellous way of preventing those sorts of paradoxes, Mel." He leant back against the console, then stood up as a cacophony of bleeps issued from it. Mel tried very hard to suppress a giggle, and failed. "Yes, well, anyway," he said, obviously trying to regain his composure. "Let's say I do return you to 1989, and you carry on your life from the point at which you left it. The chances are, the night you set off for the reunion, something will happen. Perhaps you'll miss your bus, or your taxi doesn't turn up, or you change your mind. The end result is that you don't turn up, your earlier self does, and the web of time retains its integrity." He frowned and scratched his chin. "Anyway, that's the way the first law of time is supposed to work. And don't be so rude about Anne. She's been through a lot." "Has she met the Vervoids yet?" It was the doctor's turn to laugh. "Hopefully not. But she has had rather more than her fair share of encounters with the great intelligence, and that's enough to make anybody bitter, especially since its agents killed her husband." He shot her an arch look. "So your comment about her spinsterhood was in error. The result is that all of that anger has been bottled up and directed at two people, myself and Ashley Chappell." "You?" Mel got up and prodded the doctor in the chest. "She was all over you like a bad case of measles." Mel's voice became a mockery of Anne Travers. "Oh, Doctor, do you really think so?" "Oh, Doctor, you're so clever." She made my skin crawl. "She's obsessed, Doctor. And I would have thought that somebody as clever as you would have seen right through her," she added pointedly. The doctor frowned. "She was just being friendly." "Friendly?" shrieked Mel, standing up. "When you offered her a bed in the TARDIS, it was quite obvious whose bed she was thinking of." "You're not serious." His brows knotted. "You are serious." He sighed. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, that wasn't my intention at all." "Then you should keep as far away from the old bat as possible." The doctor placed his hands on her shoulders. "Mel, please. Anne is very worried, and your own evidence does seem to corroborate her story, does it not? Ashley Chappell is obviously up to something suspicious, and it falls to me to investigate it. This is a very delicate time in Earth's development, and the fact that Chappell is responsible for the continued marketing of the micro-monolithic circuit, an alien invention, is more than enough to arouse my suspicions." He held up his hands to ward off Mel's inevitable protest, and she bit back her words. "There are too many variables in this equation, Mel, which is why I don't want you snooping around the university." "But, Doc," she implored. "Tor," he completed. "A good night's sleep. That's what's needed. Then we can all wake up refreshed and ready to sound out all that's left of Ashley Chappell logistics. Agreed?" Mel stretched, before pointing towards the door that led to the TARDIS interior. "You're right. That reunion was more exhausting than I realized. Shall I give you a call in the morning? 6 o'clock? The doctor shook his head. I doubt that I shall sleep tonight, Mel. I have some research of my own to carry out before tomorrow's exertions. Perhaps a light breakfast. Grapefruit and a bowl of bran. She smiled broadly. That sounds wonderful. She jogged towards the door. Good night, Doctor. Good night, Mel. Closing the door to the console room behind her, Mel set off down the corridor, more rounded white walls, towards her room. But sleep wasn't part of the agenda. The soft, warm glow of the oil lamp sank into the beige carpet and the damask drapes that hung from the walls. But Anne's first impression of the vestibule of the Library of St. John the Beheaded was that the place was frozen in time. Fabrics and furniture that must have been hundreds of years old looked brand new, as if age was holding itself at bay out of respect for the august institution. Anne breathed deeply and detected a potpourri of scents and odours: musk, cinnamon, lavender. Definitely not the stale smell that one usually associated with libraries. Madam? Anne turned in surprise to see a tall, thin man with a balding pate standing in the far doorway, the one that presumably led to the interior of the library. He was dressed in floor-length black robes, and Anne would have laughed at the incongruity of his attire, except that it was anything but incongruous, given the surroundings. Indeed, it was becoming increasingly difficult to believe that the end of the 20th century lay beyond the library's entrance. "Do you have an appointment?" His voice was dry and paper-like, quite fitting for a librarian, Anne decided. No, but I do have this." She nervously reached inside her handbag and pulled out a light brown ticket. This was my father's. I understand that they can be passed down." The librarian took the ticket from her and peered at it intensely before handing it back. He gave her a respectful nod. "You must be Dame Anne Travers." "That's right. I assume that I can use the library's facilities, Mr. Atos, Jeroboam Atos," he intoned with another nod. "I am the head librarian of the Library of St. John the Beheaded, and yes, of course you can." He frowned momentarily. "Or did you think that there might be some hindrance to your researches?" Anne paused. Atos had hit the nail on the head, but she was reticent to say anything in case he changed his mind. But her curiosity forced the words from her mouth. "My father's researches here led to Ashley Chapel starting a smear campaign against him. I just thought that—" "You wondered whether Mr. Chapel's ownership of the library would preclude your use of it," Atos completed with consummate tact. "Dame Anne, I can assure you that Mr. Chapel has no say in the day-to-day running of our learned establishment. Indeed, if I might make so bold, I believe that the only reason he purchased the library from the pontiff was to ensure himself a ticket. Under other circumstances, we would never have offered our services to a Philistine such as Chapel." Anne giggled with relief. "My thoughts exactly." "Good. I'm glad that's settled." Atos held his arm out to indicate the library proper. "Now let us withdraw to somewhere more comfortable, and you can tell me the nature of your inquiries. Would you care for a sweet sherry?" Mel stood in the middle of the TARDIS library with her hands on her hips. Somewhere amongst the millions of books was the single one that she was looking for. But where to begin? The library was a single corridor, miles long, with bookshelves for walls. Brass ladders punctuated the shelves every few feet. Now, Melanie," she muttered to herself, "you've got an IQ of 162. Think rationally." Unlike a normal library, the information stored here wasn't catalogued according to any system Mel recognized, although she suspected it mapped perfectly onto the doctor's chaotic thought processes. A quick glance at the nearest shelf confirmed the disorganization. A leather-bound copy of Kafka's Metamorphosis, in its original German, was squeezed between an Agatha Christie thriller and a book with golden squiggles on the spine. And then her subconscious deposited the answer in her mind. The doctor was always going on about the TARDIS being a sentient being, responsive to thoughts and emotions. Well, thoughts and emotions didn't come any clearer than hers. She sat on the floor and forced herself into the lotus position. Then she began her breathing exercises, allowing the inhalations and exhalations to clear her mind of clutter. Within a matter of minutes, only one thought remained, shining with all her concentration. It was the title of a book that the doctor had once mentioned. He had only meant it as a throwaway line, but Mel's eidetic memory had filed it away for future use, such as now. Demeter Glaus's Cybercrime, an analysis of hacking, was apparently the seminal work on breaking and entering computer systems. Written in the early 21st century, it laid open every operating system ever created up to that point. Just the ticket for a rummage through Chapel's network. Mel would have sworn that the chime rang only in her mind. She opened her eyes, and they were immediately drawn to the nearest shelf. But metamorphosis had itself metamorphosed. A burgundy leather edition of Glaus's book had replaced it. She stood up and prized it from the shelf, but wasn't prepared for what happened next. Kafka's book rematerialized, with a tinny TARDIS noise, in its place. She shrugged. Business as usual for the Doctor's time machine, she supposed, and opened the book in her hands. That was yet another surprise. The leather volume was hollow, like one of those pretentious videocassette cases her mother had favored, with a paperback of Glaus contained within. Mel winced at the lurid cover, showing a busty blonde in a leather catsuit leaning provocatively over a stylized personal computer, but a glance at the contents confirmed the Doctor's opinion. There didn't seem to be a single operating system for which Glaus hadn't described a backdoor. Windows, OS2, OffNet. There were even systems mentioned that Mel assumed hadn't been written yet, such as Amber, Gridstat, and Multivac. But there was an entire chapter devoted to the system in which she had a vested interest. Paradigm, Ashley Chapel's only successful software invention. Clutching the book tightly, Mel left the library. But as she reached the door, she turned back. "Thank you," she shouted. It always paid to be polite. Louise paid the taxi driver and waited for him to drive off before speaking. "James lives over there, number 51. "James, is it? Very cosy." Barry pulled his brown leather jacket closer around him to ward off the chill December night. "Perhaps I should go. I'd hate to play gooseberry." She gave him a playful punch on the shoulder. "Oh, very funny. I'm willing to prostitute myself to try to sort out your mess, and all you can do is crack jokes." Barry held up his hands. I'm sorry. I promise I'll keep my mouth shut from now on." "That'll be a first." She started walking towards Campling's house, and then stopped, before turning and urging Barry to hurry up. "What is it?" "Look," she pointed at number 51. The front door to the house was wide open, the hall light spilling out across the front garden. "My God, he must be eager," quipped Barry. "This isn't funny. I think something's wrong. Come on." Barry couldn't help but giggle as Louise tiptoed up the garden path, but his first glimpse inside the house confirmed that something was seriously amiss in the Campling household. A hall table had fallen across the doorway, leaving the phone off the hook, upside down on the carpet. The remnants of the telephone directory were strewn across the hall. "We should call the police," advised Barry, but Louise shook her head. "Listen," she hissed. An irregular thumping was coming from upstairs. "All the more reason to call the police." But Louise had already clambered over the table and was heading up the stairs, and Barry had no choice but to follow her. As they reached the top, the thumping grew louder, accompanied by a furious scratching noise like a horde of rabid mice. "Shouldn't we defend ourselves?" whispered Barry. "They could be armed." "Don't be stupid," she snapped, but he could see her looking around for a suitable weapon without success. They turned onto the landing, only to discover that it was in a worse state than the hallway. Pictures had been knocked off the walls, curtains ripped from the windows, and glass ornaments were smashed and ground into the carpet. And then Barry located the source of the disturbance. The bedroom door in front of them was ajar, and the thumping seemed to come from within, and now there was another noise, a gurgling. Louise was first into the room, switching on the light as she did so, and then she screamed. Barry followed her in and could fully understand her reaction. The gurgle must have been Campling's death rattle, because he was most certainly dead. Live people's heads simply didn't hang at that angle. But his dead body wasn't the cause of Lou's horror. That honor went to the creature that had its claws round Campling's broken neck. 5 feet tall, its arms and legs ended in vicious curved talons that were no doubt responsible for the ripped wallpaper and shredded bed linen. Its face was cruel and inhuman, with slitted eyes, an almost unnoticeable nose, and 2 small curved horns. But the most horrible aspect of the creature was its skin, blue-black, and tattooed with gold and silver tracery that resembled circuitry. Barry swallowed as he recognized it. "Louise," he stammered. "It's the same as the computer." Hearing Barry speak, the creature turned its face towards Louise and Barry and smiled, a smile full of tiny, sharp teeth surrounding two very nasty fangs. And then it spoke. "Hello, Barry. Hello, Louise. Enjoying your redundancy?" Despite the demon-like appearance, the droning, whining voice was instantly familiar. It was Derek Peartree.